All right, everyone. Hello. Welcome back to the Lovesick podcast. I'm your host, Jada Ford. And with me, I have my amazing
Hi,
co-host,
Michael.
Michael Fishman. So Dorothea is out today because my sister and brother-in-law just welcomed a new baby. So my mother was able to go visit them in Oregon and kind of help support wherever she can. And, I think she just wanted to hug babies for that day. So, so she's abandoned us for a little bit. No, but for real. Um, but today I'm happy to introduce our guest, Jodi Taub. She's a private practice psychotherapist who specializes in chronic illnesses and rare diseases. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jada, for having me.
Of course. So, can you just tell me? We'll start with just kind of what this psychotherapist and why chronic illnesses and rare diseases and where this all came from.
Sure. Not dissimilar to most therapists who wind up working with patients who have chronic illness and rare disease. I stumbled upon it by having my own chronic illnesses and rare disease. It actually hadn't been for a very long time. It's not a part of psychotherapy education in graduate schools. And we mostly found therapists and social workers and psychologists working in the disease specialties and in hospitals, and then slowly over time in cancer centers. But now I would say over the last 10, 15 years, we've really seen a lot more therapists who have begun to specialize in chronic illness and rare disease. And there certainly is a need for it. And there's certainly been more research and evidence around the importance of doing it. So I have lived with chronic illness my whole life. I was formally diagnosed with my major disease, which is primary immunodeficiency, known as common variable immunodeficiency, about 17 years ago. And at that time, that's when I started working in the chronic disease space. And I started doing coping skills groups for patients and caregivers. And also seeing people within my practice and lecturing and podcasting and writing and doing research. So that's me.
I love it. Thank you. That's a lot.
That's my nutshell of me and chronic disease and work.
Well, it's
So,
interesting because like we always have, I always fascinated when we talk to new guests because obviously I always learn a million things by the time I leave. But it's interesting because a lot of these things we've seen, especially with chronic illness, rare disease, but just a lot of variety of topics, they're just not covered, right? And they're just not talked about and discussed. And they just have not you in school, like you just said, like it's not something like when you went to school, they were like, let's talk about this. It's like we don't see it often. So it's really cool when, I don't know if sometimes it takes having something to kind of promote it. But I just like the idea of spreading awareness to.
and there is a lot, yes, you're exactly right. And there is a lot more of a focus now within my field, but there wasn't. And that was part of the reason at the time. I was already a therapist, and I realized the amount of sophistication and emotional wherewithal that someone needed to navigate our medical system and to navigate the emotional response to living with a chronic illness. And
Mhm.
I pivoted. So the first part of my career, I worked with children and families, and I worked in foster care and adoption, and then I worked in the schools. And it was at that time that I went into private practice because it allowed me the flexibility to attend all of my appointments and to go to my infusions. And I couldn't work a 9 to 5 at that point. So I made a pivot in my career because of my chronic illness, but I also made an appropriate pivot in terms of learning how to help people who are coping with the same things that I was as well.
Wow. What's a typical day like for you living with your chronic illness?
Oh, Jada. There is no typical day. That's the whole thing. There is no typical day. So my disease, primary immunodeficiency, means that my immune system doesn't function appropriately. And as a result, I have 30 different healthcare conditions. And at any point, all of them are flaring or not flaring. So I have to manage a lot of medications. I have to get an infusion every 2 weeks of immunoglobulin therapy that runs for 6 hours. I'm on IV antibiotics right now, so I have nursing that comes every 4 or 5 days. So I have a lot of stuff that I juggle. And also, when I have a health flare, so it could be I might get a skin infection, or I had pneumonia and I had sinus surgery. I have to kind of pivot my day a little bit. So what I try to do is make room for the definitives. So I make room for my client patient sessions that day, and then I also kind of have some space in between just in case I have to run to a doctor's appointment or pick up a lab. But I've learned over the years to live with uncertainty, and I just try to fit it all in. And then I do a lot of my paperwork I might do, on the weekends or at night. And so it just kind of depends.
Wow.
So that's my day.
Well, I think it kind of positions you in this beautiful space because I don't think anybody who's never experienced that would have the same capacity for compassion and understanding and the challenges and the mental challenges that probably lots of your patients experience. So I think it because living with someone with a chronic illness is a unique experience and is a totally, and for outside people, it you don't know what you don't know. And,
Mhm.
and I do you find that a lot of your patients kind of have that experience and kind of there can be frustration in the things other people don't know or don't know how to support you in or the very changing kind of landscape of your schedule and life.
Yeah, yes, for sure. And the thing about it is it's ongoing. So I think within our society, one of the things that I think that people really struggle with, and I call it the sickness wrap up. We're used to like, okay, we get a diagnosis, and then there's a treatment, and then you get better. So it's like a nice wrap up of a story. But that's not the trajectory of chronic illness. The trajectory of chronic illness is, all right, today's really bad. Oh, today's good. Now it's bad. And there's the ups and downs. And what happens with that is it creates this sort of perception of what I coined as inconsistent capabilities. So a lot of times, friends and loved ones will say, well, wait, you went out that day, you were able to go for a walk that day, you were able to take the kids to school. Why can't you do it today? And then there starts to become some judgment that people will feel that, even, and sometimes that's internal. You might think yourself, like, wait a second, I was able to do it this day, I can't do it that day. What do other people think of that? And I really think there's a greater lack of understanding in our larger community of what chronic illness looks like, because we live in the US and we like things to have a nice wrap up, a good story. And that's not how it works. Like, how does it work when things don't get better? And I think that's really hard for people to understand.
And I mean,
Yeah,
even to pivot that, sorry, Michael, go ahead.
no, by all means.
No, I'm saying so, but you were saying people to understand that. So that kind of goes into what we've talked about with like relationships and friendships and having to explain or when to tell. And we've talked about this a few times on the show, and you and I, Jody, have talked about this separate. But when for someone who's starting dating, right? We talk about the importance of benefits of partnership relationships. But when you start dating, when is a how do we go there? How do we start there? How do we, because we always say, and Michael's very good at saying this, how we always send our representatives, like when we're on a date, how do we disclose any of that type of information, especially when it's something, for things people haven't even heard of before and have trouble even understanding themselves what it is for you to walk them through it.
Well, I think you brought up a couple different subjects that I'd, love to unpack. One is talking, at the tail end, you talked a little bit about rare disease, and that is different than known diseases. How and when to tell. and how to approach dating. I start off, the first thing I always say is it sort of depends on where you are in your journey too. If you're early in diagnosis or you're going through a period of time where you feel particularly vulnerable and you're not ready to date, that's okay too. If you're single, you don't have to be pushed to say, okay, well, I should be doing all of this, because being in a relationship and dating requires vulnerability. It is worth it. And relationships are important. And I will say this: every single person who lives with a chronic illness or a rare disease is capable of being in a relationship and capable of being loved. And I don't think that we hear that enough. We don't get those messages from society. And often we don't think of that ourselves. And it's important, but I think timing is important too. So if you're in the beginning of your journey and you don't feel comfortable, you're not there yet. If you're at a point where you're ready and you want to start dating, I think just like everything else, we have to approach it with some insight and some information and some tools before you get there. So I always tell people to think about in advance how much you want to share and how you tell your story. So, how you tell your story will impact how that person takes it in. So, if I walked into a date and I was like, hey, I'm on IV antibiotics and I have an immune system that doesn't really work, and I don't know, I might just wind up in the hospital once a year with surgery, they might go running out the door. But if I feel that I meet somebody and over time, I feel like this is somebody who's deserving of me sharing my experience and that it's a comfortable, fair space, then I might to share a bit of information in the same way that we would set boundaries around anything else in our lives. Like, you don't walk into, your first date and start sharing like, oh gosh, I've had a bunch of failed relationships and, my parents got divorced, and I bring it into every single relationship that I have. Right? You gotta think about your chronic illness story in a way that's comfortable for you, but also comfortable for the other person who really doesn't know what this experience is like. So I think of a few different ways to tell your story and where it's applicable. Think about how you want to share it and when is a good time to share. There might be somebody that you really connect with, and let's say you have gastrointestinal issues, right? And like, you show up at a restaurant and like, you can't eat that food or you have food restrictions, that conversation might come up, and you might say, hey, I just have some like food restrictions, and that might be all that you share. And then you kind of get into, that's why I explain these things to the waiter or waitress. Or you might be somebody who really connects with someone and you're open and you say, hey, I have Crohn's disease and, I got to be careful. And there's some foods that I don't eat, but this is why I've chosen not to share the dessert with you or whatnot. So I think it's about approaching these things with some insight and some practice so you're not caught off guard. I also recommend practicing questions or difficult questions that people may have asked you so that you can answer that in a way that doesn't set off a trauma response, like, oh, are you going to be able to have children? Like, or, I've gotten that question, back in the day, and being like, oh my gosh, I'm on a third date and someone found out about my illness and they asked if I could have kids. And that's a really personal question that, I might have a lot of feelings about, may not really want to share or feel comfortable in sharing quite yet, even though it's okay for the person to ask. So you've got to kind of think of the zingers of things that have hit you before and how to approach that. Um, in terms of rare disease, there's a different approach, because if I told somebody I have diabetes, I told somebody I have, irritable bowel syndrome, those are recognizable diseases that people can say, okay, I know the trajectory of this, like, this is what you might have to do. And they could ask questions that are relatable. And also, they may know a little bit of information about how it impacts your life. When you're walking in with a rare disease diagnosis, they have no idea how it impacts your life. So you have to share how it impacts your life. But I think it's really important to share not only the ways that things can be difficult, but how you've adjusted and how capable you are. So, for example, if I walked in and said I have a rare disease with 30 different healthcare conditions and I attend about 10 hours of doctor's appointments a week, that may seem really intense versus, hey, I run a full time business. I volunteer, I ride my bike, I work out, I live a normal life with modifications. That's very, very different. And, so my story might be, hey, I get chronic persistent infections. I need to be careful around that. I take precautions. I wear masking inside, especially during the winter, during, crowded circumstances. But otherwise, like I'm pretty healthy to lead a normal way of life. Then you sort of soothe the other person's nervous system and those questions that they ask so that there's not a lot of assumptions left.
That's
Yeah, I
right.
want to go back
That's
and
my
highlight.
long-winded
No,
answer to
it's
something.
great. No, and
I'll
so
just keep
important.
talking.
I think it's great and it's amazing. I want to highlight something you said at the very beginning because I think it's so important. People who have chronic or rare diseases can absolutely have beautiful, healthy relationships and deserve all of the same life features that everybody does. And I think sometimes people restrict themselves out of worry. And I also think societally, sometimes we put up boundaries. If someone runs for the door right away, they did you a favor. They saved you a lot
Correct.
of time. Like
Correct.
that was a gift because they were not equipped. And the truth is, if we all live long enough, we're all going to have something to deal with. And most people are dealing with something. It's really about how you presented it, which is here's the life I live. Here are the things that I'm working with, or here's the things that can be problematic or create things, but I have it under control, and here's what I know. And then the person either accepts you or they don't.
That's exactly right. And, what you said is also true, Michael, is that, listen, we're all human. No one gets out of this without having a healthcare condition or having some sort of, health problem at some point. 1 out of every 4 Americans lives with a chronic healthcare condition. It's a lot of people. And as you age, those statistics increase. And we all have something, I always say, everybody's got baggage, it's how you carry it. And you can choose how you carry that. And I think people who are living with chronic and rare diseases also need to remember the resilience because we always look at the trauma of illness instead of looking at the resilience and all the ways in which living with a chronic illness has made us more capable rather than less. And to also promote that about yourself.
Yeah, the promotion I think is very healthy because that's it's just a very healthy thing to be like, this is what I have, but you know what? See the positive side because I think that also it's because I know we have talked about this before, but like when you are first diagnosed with something, you might be taking it a different way than later down the line. Once you've known how to manage your own illness, you're kind of just like, all right, well, I've been, running and jumping rope, whatever. Whereas the person is like, can you do that? I don't understand. Is that fine? Like, so I think how you look at it and how you approach it and how you speak of your illness, I think is powerful in a powerful way, for
Yes.
sure.
And Michael also brought up an important part of dating is that, we all want to look for secure attachments,
Yeah.
people who are able and comfortable to engage in healthy relationships. And if someone sees your, chronic illness, and they will. So I think we need to accept that part too, that there are going to be people who cannot cope with this, just like there are people who cannot cope with lots of different circumstances. They're not the right person for you. And there are going to be people who reject us for our illness. But I think we all need, there needs to be an acceptance of that. But that also doesn't mean at the same time that there won't be other people who won't.
Agree.
Yeah, I mean, they say 1 out of 10 people has a rare condition or is maybe even undiagnosed. I spent a lot of time around the rare disease community because in my marriage, the first few years, everything was great. We had 2 kids, and then all of a sudden, we got ready to have a third, and there was this kind of sudden surprise that some part of the labs aren't matching up. And I remember listening to other couples and other people and hearing a lot of people who ended up alone, who their marriage kind of broke up. And I was like, well, that person really told you who they were and they weren't going to be there for you anyway. We as a family, initially, my spouse kind of went through you kind of have to go through the grief stages, right? There is some bargaining, some pain, some anger, some frustration, there's acceptance, there's all these things you have to kind of transition through. And then we just got active about how do we manage life and make this the most beneficial. And it was actually really beautiful because our kids were very conscious of like, how you feeling today? And she used to get the thing a lot of like, well, you don't look sick. And
Mhm.
it's like, well, Dot usually says this the most. It's like, well, what does sick look like, right? And we used to go through that constantly, but it was a very beautiful thing, I think, as a family, because we just understood, we were much more aware of what were symptoms that we noticed that the world didn't, right? And we would wrap things up early, or we would do things to kind of make sure the situation was good. We made sure that we had medication on hand. We made sure that we kept track of everything. The right people will be your advocate and your teammate if in a secure scenario. If you're not in a secure scenario, they probably weren't the right person. And the beautiful part is, if it doesn't work out, the right person may come along, or they may become secure, right? You can become secure in the process. It's okay to have these insecure moments as long as you work together as a team to create security and support.
Yeah, agree. Agree.
Now, when you mention secure attachments, can you kind of describe that for listeners and for people, and really good ways to identify that? Because I think there's a lot of people who want that but don't know what it really looks like or means.
Sure. Attachment theory is one of the, most research psychological relationship theories, and it's about attachment is to our primary attachments are to our parents, our significant others, and to our children. And when we're looking for, and you brought up very well that you can form, your attachment might be insecure, meaning unstable at a time period. But what you want to form is a secure attachment, someone who's able to be comfortable in a relationship and be able to recognize that life will have highs and lows, but they don't leave the relationship because of the stressors. So if they're in a relationship and there's a stressor, just like you showed in your family, that you work together and you become stronger. You don't leave because something's uncomfortable. And so there are people who may run, anxious, which means they feel maybe a little bit over attached. And some people who will tend to be avoidant, meaning they sort of get scared when there's more commitment. But our attachments, we are who we are in the context of the other person. So if somebody is making us secure and feel secure, you're going to be more secure in the relationship. If someone is not being available and making you feel unsteady or unstable, then you are going to feel more anxious or insecure. So that's an important part. We're not just, a lot of times what happens now in popular culture, there's been a lot more books around attachment. And I always say this as a therapist, you got to learn about this in the context of yourself and with your partner. But for people who have chronic healthcare conditions, they need a steady and secure relationship, because the chronicity of chronic healthcare conditions is that it does go up and down, just like that. And grief goes up and down. So I just wrote a recent article about grief, and for grief for people who have chronic healthcare conditions, it's not the Kubler-Ross, where the theory you were talking a little bit about, Michael, where there's the different stages. Ours is not linear because the grief continues. So you might go through a period of time where things are going well, but then you have another flare, and at that point you're experiencing loss again, or there might be a new healthcare condition that pops up and you're unable to work you no longer able to work, or you can't do a different hobby. And so because within the lifespan of someone living with chronic illness, we need to have secure attachments. We need to have people that we know we can count on.
I think we had we had a couple people who had been on who had been like caretakers of loved ones, and you had a good points off off the record before, but like if you have someone that is your caretaker, how are you taking care of that person yourself as the character, as the loved one? Yeah.
Yes. And I think that's I run a few caregivers groups, and one of the things that happens in that dynamic is sometimes we forget to nurture the part that is about the relationship itself. You know, whether you're a parent or you're a spouse, you still are a parent and a spouse. And we need to continue to do that. And I think the other part that happens in caregiving relationships sometimes is that the caregiver themselves doesn't want to burden their loved one, so they won't ask from them. They feel like, oh, I can't ask them to do this, or I can't share this emotional burden because I don't want to put anything else on them. So it creates this sort of loneliness for the other person, or a resentment that their needs aren't getting met. And that's why it's really important to talk to either your child or to your significant other, to say like, hey, like, these are some things I need too. And to remember that your loved one also wants to feel human, and they also want to be able to give back. They want to feel like they're a significant part of the relationship outside of their illness, and that there's a mutual exchange. And there's always a way, no matter what your illness or disability is, there's always a way for all of us to give.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's so important that you be creative and find, I mean, going back to both attachment, ways of soothing your partner. If somebody is anxious, consistently giving them some form of reassurance and connection. If somebody's avoidant and needs space, creating that space and the ability, but the safety for both parties, knowing that you're still here and you're coming back, right? But also, whether it be love languages, which is a very well researched kind of way of expressing it, but just in general, finding creative ways. Like, you might not be able to take a 5 mile hike to a waterfall. That doesn't mean you can't take a small hike if hiking was something you guys always did together, right? Doesn't mean you can't find a place where you might be able to ride part of the way and then still go see the waterfall, right? You may just have to come up with a creative way to get there. And in your home, it's making moments, right? Bids for connection, and then honoring those from each other.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
What are some of the things that you hear most, either from caregiver or from, I don't want to use the word patient because I think that's where we get in trouble a lot of times too, is people start feeling defined by either their illness, or care caregivers start defining their role as caregiver and patient. And the truth is, no, that's your partner. You're giving care. You're not a caregiver.
Well, I say a lot of times I use the word loved one, because a lot of caregivers, there are informal relationships that they do have, like such as like an aunt and an uncle, or even, I know Jada with you, like, your mom is the person, you're the child who's caregiving to a parent. So I like to use the word loved one. Because it also, hence lovesick. There's a love part of this. I think that it's when the relationship becomes disconnected, when the two people aren't talking about what they need, and also those periods of loss. So I had recently, a caregiver of mine who was really feeling the loss of this person's significant other not being able to do physical activities anymore. And you gave a great example. It was actually, they were talking about hiking, and that was something that they really did. And now this person's significant other can no longer, like, they have mobility issues. So they came up with a modification, and the significant other goes with the caregiver, and the caregiver goes on the hike, and the significant other drives in the car, and they actually go to the hiking spot, and they have lunch together. And, the caregiver goes on the hikes, and the loved one reads a book. But they're still in nature, and they still go on that trip together. And that's a modification where they didn't have to give it up. So you're exactly right. I think it's finding ways to be creative, and then also acknowledging each other's losses. So, because a lot of times caregivers feel very bad, they feel guilty because their lives are impacted by their partner's disability. So they lose something of their lives that they no longer can do, or if they can still do it, they feel guilty about it. And so I think it's finding that bridge in between to talk to your loved one about it and say, hey, your loved one might say, hey, you know what? I know I can't do that, but I want you to be able to go do it. It's okay. I'm giving you permission. This doesn't mean you're taking something from me. I still want you to be able to do that. But I also want to find a way for us to find a new way to connect so that those two things can be true.
It's really about the conversations that you
Yeah,
have to
I
have.
think for me, a good example in that, and you can tell me if you disagree, but one of the ones is, what was the part of that experience that you really loved sharing? For example, if the hike, the part of it was seeing the journey and talking about it along the way. One of the things that I know a loved one has done, and I've actually done this for someone, is record the hike, is
Mhm.
take a camera, record the hike, and then watch it together and talk about the things the same as we would have had we been on the hike physically together. The question is, you have to have this kind of hard conversation. This is where I really think a big part of love is like consideration, right? Will watching that make the person feel bad for physically not going, or does it provide the key element of connection that you both enjoyed, which was sharing the journey, right? And you have to be conscious of whether that is, because it may be different for the two parties.
Yes.
Yeah. I also think just it feels kind of like the loss and rejection part that we were just talking about, because having to not compromise, I don't want to say that, that's not, I don't want to use that word, but like how you were saying, to find other ways to make it work, but in a way one person's going to feel guilty no matter what position you're in. So it's like, how do we get to that point where we're, even if we feel bad, even if we feel a little bit guilty, how do we make something a little bit better and we still enjoy the same things? So that's a lot.
Validation and conversation and negotiation. I think those losses, when a person's no longer able to do something, and even if you want your loved one to do it and you can't be there, it's still hard. So sometimes it's just nice to hear that the other person says, hey, I know that you really would want to be here and I'm really sorry. Sometimes it's just a simple sorry and a simple, acknowledgement of that like, I know that you would really want this. And then I think the other part is really talking through, there may be times where you're fine that your significant other goes to this, event without you. And there may be times where you're like, you know what? I've been home a lot recently and this is really hard for me. And I kind of wish you wouldn't go this time. Would that be okay? So I think it's a constant negotiation.
Yeah, I agree. What do you have going on these days, Jodi?
In
What do you
terms of,
everything? Jess, how are you and what are you working on these days? Or how, how can our audiences find you and all the things you're doing?
oh yeah, sure. One of the things that I have done is I've created a lot of free content because I think it is really important because, I can't say this again and again. Community, community, community. It's our social relationships that make all of this easier for everybody, and finding other people who also understand this and get this is really important. And there's a lot of patient support groups out there. Even if you have a rare disease, there are patient support groups within the patient support group network in your rare disease. And for ones that, are so rare that they don't, there's the National Organization of Rare Diseases that combines all of the rare diseases and gives people a place. So if you do go to my website, which is Jodi, Jodi, Taub, Taub, so my first name, last name, therapy.com. And underneath my section in the media, I have all of my articles, research, lectures, and podcasts. I write a monthly article series about coping with chronic illness, about a lot of the subjects we talked about today. So that's underneath there and listed in articles, and different podcasts and lectures are all underneath there too.
I love it.
It's beautiful. Give everybody resources. Because you need a community. I think that's one of the things that also happens is
Yes.
if the caregiver, the loved one, and the person experiencing it, if they start to isolate themselves, you start to feel alone, and then you cannot fulfill every need. And sometimes you need an outside person, right? You can have the greatest partner and teammate in this journey, but occasionally you're both going to need some space, or a space to talk about things with other people, and someone who has shared experience from your side of the perspective. And I think those are all really important. So I hope people utilize your resources.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. Well, we are so happy that you were able to join us today. It's been a long time coming, and I'm so happy you were on the show.
I'm so glad that we got to talk about this today, because I know, Jada, you and I have talked quite a bit informally over the years about what this has been like. And I'm so glad that you have the Lovesick podcast too, because this is also another way to, as Michael said, to decrease loneliness, is that we all have this shared experience. And there's good things that come from all of this too.
Well, thank you all for listening, and yeah, have a great one next time.